Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a restful spring break. Here we are talking about Egypt in time and place. It's one of those civilizations that many people have heard about, especially those interested in archaeology to begin with. The most important thing is that Egypt has a place in the history of archaeology and in the history of the world in very important ways. Its formation, though, as a society in the ancient world, has been re-examined in recent years, and it turns. Here you can see an example of what the landscape may have looked like during this time period. Much more like the savanna Serengeti of East Africa than the hyper-arid conditions of much of Egypt and North Africa today. This is known as the African humid period, and it began around the end of the last glacial period and reached a peak around 11,500 years ago. And during this period, the sand sea, sort of Tatooine-looking landscape that we've come to expect for the Sahara Desert was in nowhere to be found in its form that we think of today. Much more savanna-like conditions, enormous lakes and massive marshes with fish and waterfowl, streams and tributary systems allowing the movement of even fish species from equatorial Africa as far north as southern Libya and Algeria. And of course, human beings, being the species that they are, when this opportunity emerged after the end of the Ice Age, they rapidly colonized this landscape, and sizable populations were widespread for thousands of years. But this all ended very abruptly a little over 5,000 years ago. Here you can see an example, a satellite reconstructed image of an area showing Chad, parts of Sudan there on the right side of the map. And you can see this massive lake and river tributary system. This is Mega Lake Chad. The area in green there that you can see is just the tiny little part of the lake that's left today, known as Lake Chad. It's still a huge lake, but this was the largest freshwater lake in the world at the time that it existed. And this is what the landscape was filled with during this time period prior to the emergence of dynastic Egypt. Here you can see an area in southwestern Libya, in the mountains there, where you have extensive rock art, including not just paleontological records that we recover today, but actually contemporary records that people were making of things like giraffes and elephants and ibex and leopards and lions and all kinds of very savanna groups of species that are nowhere found in the middle of the Sahara today. Even here, later on, after the development of the domestication of cattle, people were still occupying this landscape, even during the process of increasing aridity. People still remained very widespread across a very depopulated landscape today. So this ancient world that is hard to even imagine today, what are the consequences of climate change on that landscape and on those people? Well, one argument that can be made is that the rise of Egyptian civilization followed the development or immigration of agricultural societies that had established themselves in the Fayum oasis west of what is today the Nile, in this very fertile and wet North African Saharan conditions. When you see over the next several thousand years, though, following about 7,000 years ago, these societies that had once maintained connections and contacts both north and south and east and west across this area became increasingly fragmented as conditions worsened, with the groups retreating to refuges like Gilf Kebir and the Nile Valley, some of them returning to specialized pastoralism, which imagery we're familiar with from talking earlier in the semester about the Bedouin, whereas other groups migrated southward back to the Sudan and more equatorial Africa. In Egypt itself, the onset of hyperaridity around 5,500 years ago forced the migration of already structured agricultural societies into the Nile Valley refuge, where they developed greater innovation and organization rapidly over the next 500 years, so that by 5,000 years ago, a complex pharaonic society dominated the entire Egyptian Nile Valley, leaving this behind. It would be remarkable to think about the kinds of early seeds of Egyptian and other African civilizations that are buried archaeologically under these dunes and this intimidating landscape. It's pretty interesting to consider. As an interesting side note to this, the dust storms from the desertified Lake Chad represent a remarkable source of wind-blown dust, one of the largest sources of wind-blown dust in the world. And this cradle of early agricultural humanity in Africa that is now largely non-arable, you can't grow anything there. The dust that's blown up from those landscapes makes its way across the Atlantic and is actually one of the major sources fertilizing the Amazon River Basin and the rainforests that are among what are referred to as the lungs of the planet. And so as these things shift, the systems of the planet have an ability to accommodate them in interesting ways. And the kinds of change that we are going to experience over the next few centuries in our own future, we'll have to see what different kinds of systems emerge as a result of that. If you're interested in looking at some of the sources for this information, I've included them here. You can examine these more fully if you would like more information on this particular topic. So then moving into the parts of Egyptian civilization that many people are more familiar with. The great civilizations, as it were. If you think about how this begins as part of a movement of people from an earlier way of life where they're being concentrated into smaller and smaller spaces. The beginnings of Egyptian civilization are not should not be too surprising. The pro-dynastic period beginning around 5000 BC, as people begin to converge more and more into the Nile Valley, finally beginning with a unification. It's interesting that many of the early, even pre-dynastic and early dynastic artwork include a fair amount of fantastical animals, which some biologists have begun examining some of this ancient artwork to really try to reconstruct what kinds of animals may have existed during this time period. But even by the early dynastic period, this artwork begins to include some animals that never existed, things like griffins, and you can see these giraffe, leopard type creatures on this particular palette here. These may represent legends of extinct species. When the species are no longer around for artists to look at, they rely largely on the stories and legends and grandpa's tales to be able to come up with visual representations of them. And in those ways, things can be embellished and built upon and combined into these more mythological types. Whereas others that you can see here are clearly recognizable. On the right side of the picture there towards the bottom, that's a giraffe. That's not anything you would mistake. But then immediately above that, there's what looks like a griffin of some sort. So you can tell there's a combination of both easily recognizable species as well as more fantastical ones here. The unification of Egypt is probably one of the more important dimensions of studying this time period. After the consolidation of populations from a very large region that had already developed agriculture and pastoralism into a increasingly small area of arable land, Egypt became a geography with a whole lot of independent chiefdoms, and they were all competing for different power. This circumscription led to more and more and more centralization of power into fewer and fewer centers, largely through warfare. Even before the unification of Egypt and the establishment of pharaonic rule, the Egyptian rulers had begun to promote themselves as divine or semi-divine figures, living gods on earth. And their authority, therefore, was not derived from a social contract with the population, but with actual divine right. The Narmer palette that we'll look at here in a second commemorates the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt in around 3100 BC. Recently, excavations have identified the tomb of King Scorpion, dating to also around this same time period, King Scorpion II. And increasingly, based upon analyses of artwork from mace found in King Scorpion II's tomb and the Narmer palette, there is increasing suspicion that Scorpion II was actually an alias of Narmer. And if that's the case, then the Scorpion King was the first king of a unified Egypt. Not this one, but a different one, obviously. Here, next, you can see a picture of the actual palette of Narmer, a very, very famous artifact from early Egypt. And you can see highlighted there in red the king wearing the crowns of both Upper and Lower Egypt, symbolizing the unification of a once divided land. And there's just some remarkable aspects to the Narmer palette as well, in showing Horus there as the patron of kingship, as well as a recurrence on the right image there, showing some of those fantastical creatures as well. What's interesting is that not just the Narmer palette, but other archaeological and bioarchaeological evidence support this reality of the conflict that existed during this unification period and the existence of this first pharaoh. What's interesting is that the unification probably was not something that happened from one day to the next. This is not like a treaty was signed and everybody agreed that this was how things were going to go. Prior leaders before Narmer, Scorpion, and other political units had undoubtedly laid much of the groundwork for the unification, which, although it was accomplished through force, had economic and social value for the region as a whole, or the system could not have been maintained. They had to get people to buy into this new structure, else it would not have survived the first pharaoh. An important thing to remember is that it's very easy to conquer, structurally and administratively speaking. It's extremely difficult to unify and create a single state where the members have enough common interests between them to make it a functioning political and economic unit. If there's no reason for people to have that sense of common shared purpose, then why bother paying those taxes? Why bother working on those public works? There has to be a larger essence of what it means for a state to exist. Even at this early date, writing, administration, and bureaucracy were essential to the consolidation of power and the function of the early Egyptian states. Both in the past and now, supreme rulers thrive on propaganda. And during this period of unification, there was continued rebellion and unrest. In fact, as I mentioned, it wasn't accomplished overnight. It appears that at least 4 centuries went by before Egypt as a self-recognized entity came into existence. And in this early dynastic period, you see the earliest examples of writing that we talked about before, and the emergence of what we refer to as the Old Kingdom. This is the time period of the pyramids. This is a time of very powerful rulers and a young state with a very tiny minority of privileged people. There's not a middle class that's very well developed in this time period. And it's led by a divine king. And the first developments of contacts outside Egypt begin to bring it into the larger world. And we see the emergence of very, very explicit dimensions of divine power and authority, to the point that the pharaoh was attributed the actual rising and falling of the Nile River, rather than the monsoons in equatorial Africa. It's during this period that you see the construction of the great complex at Giza during the fourth dynasty, including the Sphinx. And you can see the territorial extent of Egypt, very much tied to this river, this Nile River, the center and essence of this state. And even though during the Old Kingdom you have a much smaller segment of people in the middle class of any kind of status, the general structure of a society that was, in not missing the irony of it, very pyramidally structured in terms of the proportions of the population at different levels, with the pharaoh at the top and farmers and slaves at the bottom. One thing I'm going to go through here is one of the architectural expressions that we're most familiar with for Egypt is that of the pyramid, right? It's even on the dollar bill. And these pyramids are often taken by some people on certain channels to be evidence for the involvement of extraterrestrial travelers in assisting people with their construction of burial chambers. The problem is that the Egyptian pyramids are a clear outgrowth of a long-standing tradition of mortuary temples and tombs that begins well before the dynastic period, well before the first pharaoh. You see these mastaba tombs. You can see here. They're flat-roofed tombs that are at least as much a temple where the descendants of the deceased person being honored in such a fashion would go to perform rituals of ancestor veneration. Here's an artistic representation of one. Here's a more sterile view of what they comprise, and they were often built in complexes. Different people from the same families, as in cemeteries around the world, would be buried together in clusters. And this would be a fourth dynasty group of mastabas, because mastabas continued to be constructed well after the emergence of the first larger pyramidal structures, because not everybody's a pharaoh. Here you can see a transverse section of the step pyramid of King Djoser at the Saqqara necropolis. This is sort of termed to be the first pyramid. It's fascinating because it began as a mastaba tomb with the standard shaft and burial chambers, but was then enlarged once into a 4-layered mastaba, and then before it was finally completed, it ended up having 6 layers. Uh, what's really, really cool about it, too, from an archaeological standpoint, is that there are a labyrinth of underground tunnels beneath this pyramid that measure 3.5 miles. There's storage rooms, temples, and at least 13 false entrances into this area. Fortunately, like many other tombs in Egypt, it was looted in antiquity. Uh, the thing about this is that it gives the impression of a very organic growth and in-process development, including rooms abandoned mid-construction, especially when you contrast this with the later pyramids at Giza. Here you can see one of the really fascinating architectural structures of early Egypt. This is the Meidum Pyramid, and it may have been begun earlier by the third dynasty, but it was worked on by Snefru, who was the founding pharaoh of the fourth dynasty. This was around 2600 BCE and located at the Dashur necropolis. It suffered a catastrophic collapse during construction due to the impossibly steep angle attempted when the builders tried to convert the original stepped design, which is still inside the core of this, into a smooth-sided form. You can kind of see how that was going on, the different layers of masonry there. They were trying to turn it into a smooth-sided form, but without rebar and other construction engineering techniques that were unavailable at the time. That angle is very, very prone to structural collapse. And so construction was never finished here, and no burial appears to have been made. Work was transferred to the Bent Pyramid by the same pharaoh, Senefru, and he was the father of Khufu, who built the first of the Great Pyramids at Giza. The Bent Pyramid may have already been under construction when the Meidum Pyramid collapsed, and builders then attempted to change the angle of construction to avoid the same fate, but ultimately they abandoned this effort as well, fairly close to completion. But you can see there on the right-hand corner, it's unstable as well. Here you can see the Red Pyramid at Dashur, which was the first successfully completed smooth-sided pyramid. And it was completed in 2590 BCE. This was the third and final pyramid constructed during Snefru's reign, and it's got an even lower angle when compared to later pyramids. And this appears to have been the result of increasingly conservative engineering efforts following the structural failures of the two previous pyramids. The pyramids then at Giza have worked out all of these engineering things over multiple generations of trying and failing and developing a variety of skills and new techniques, figuring out the geometry of this. You can see there's a much more structured nature to the Giza pyramids of Khufu and Khafre that happened later. The pyramids at Giza of Khufu and Khafre and Khefren, the very well-known imagery, they are the product of this development over multiple generations of techniques of construction, techniques of engineering, geometry, architectural design, and the most important thing that you should get out of this is not built by aliens. Aliens wouldn't have needed several generations to figure out that you can't build a stone pyramid without rebar at that angle. They would have come in with some, I'm guessing, fairly sophisticated engineering specs ahead of time. These are remarkable achievements of human beings who, working hard, using the strength of their mind and the strength of their hands, were able to achieve something that still is awe-inspiring today. It requires no recourse to aliens, and given the history that I just entailed, it should be even more remarkable. One of the things that's fascinating is that these pyramids, built by only the fourth dynasty of Egypt, well over 4,500 years ago, were the last full-scale pyramids ever built by Egyptian pharaohs. After this, they moved to constructing tombs like the tomb of Tutankhamun in the Valley of the Kings, Hatshepsut's mortuary tomb during the Middle Kingdom, but pyramids were only built during the Old Kingdom. So even the Egyptian pharaohs recognized the awe-inspiring level of labor that went into this construction. So what happened to the Old Kingdom? Why do we have the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom? Well, during the Old Kingdom's declining years, a very prolonged drought. We're talking on the order of multiple decades of drought in an area that's already hyper-arid. Ruined the fields and reduced the agricultural productivity of the landscape. And this caused a famine which challenged the claim of the divine pharaohs that they possessed supernatural power. It's hard to maintain these claims that your statements, your desires, your wants are enough to make things happen when people are dying and your society is falling apart, and your statements are not enough to make that happen. So this really challenged that idea that the divine pharaohs had that kind of supernatural power. The result was that Egypt fractured into smaller states. Those areas that were capable of feeding their people and keeping things running survived, but they were no longer under the authority of a central government. And you can see you have the 8th dynasty in the south with a couple of other smaller states in between, and then the 9th and 10th dynasties centered around Memphis in the north. So these are actually competing parallel dynasties rather than the sequential order that we see during other time periods. And this is the first intermediate period. It then takes a couple of centuries before Egypt is actually reunified. And this doesn't happen until 2040 BC. So almost 6 centuries after or almost over 5 centuries after the construction of the Great Pyramids, Egypt is reunified. As concerns over internal security and their expanding power towards the south into what they refer to as Nubia, today the modern state of Sudan, encouraged the increased involvement of the government structure in efforts to increase agricultural productivity, into the development of trade networks, into government subsidies for different kinds of industries to help encourage and support certain kinds of activities that would further provide stability and enhance the power of the state. You see massive public works, not just tombs for the pharaohs, but massive irrigation projects, planned cities, new projects to expand productivity, mines, factories, and whatnot. Really begin to emerge, as well as the first military expeditions southward into Nubia to secure valuable trade materials. And you see the development during the Middle Kingdom of the development of social classes more fine-grained than before. It's not just the king and the nobles and then the peasants. You begin to see the genuine emergence of an artisan class and a military class and a priesthood within this structure that kind of creates a more stable structure. There's more different layers of people with different kinds of competing interests that have the effect of creating a more nuanced structure to society. What is interesting is that there's just a lot more state-run and micromanaged planned towns and industries than ever before. This is sort of the height of a much more socialized political structure. And you can see here some of the major cities and centers during the Middle Kingdom. Some of the more remarkable artworks in terms of carved and painted tombs begin to emerge during the Middle Kingdom. Very familiar kinds of imagery during this Middle Kingdom period, and the full development of hieroglyphic script. But that doesn't last either. The second intermediate period occurs, and this increased trade brought a large number of foreign traders and artisans to the delta region of Egypt, which the Egyptians referred to as Hyksos. And they were probably largely from the Levant and Jordan areas, so from to the northeast. During a period of weak pharaohs, they managed to gradually increase their political influence, and they eventually seized control of the state in the north. So they ruled Lower Egypt for 90 years before being ousted by Pharaoh Ahmose in 1550 BC. However, the influence of the Hyksos was not entirely negative. They brought new technologies and increased the ties of Egypt with the rest of the Mediterranean and Mesopotamian world in ways that had never before been true. This was the time period when Egypt really joined the kind of community of states and civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean. What's interesting is that during this period, the Hyksos controlled only areas in the northeastern part of the country. The lower Egyptian area was largely under their influence, but Upper Egypt and areas around Thebes were fully outside of their control. And so you had still independent Egyptian political systems, but not as a unified whole. Egypt is finally reunified under the new kingdom, and this is Imperial Egypt. This is the Egypt that we hear about in the Abrahamic texts. This is the Egypt that financed large military expeditions into the Near East, largely paying for them with Nubian gold from sub-Saharan Africa. And this was the Egypt that competed with Mesopotamian and Anatolian states. It competed with the Hittites and competed with the Babylonians. This was the Egypt that had the contacts with the Minoans that we talked about. This was the time of Ramses the Great and the peak of Egyptian power and civilization. And you can see here, this is an extent all the way up into Syria and all the way down south into what is today northwestern Ethiopia, well past the sixth cataract of the Nile, where the Blue and the White Nile separate. This was as big as Egypt ever got in the 15th century BC, a remarkable time period. This was also the time period of Pharaoh Hatshepsut, who came to the throne of Egypt in 1478 BC. And her rise to power was noteworthy because it required her to utilize her bloodline, education, and a very detailed understanding of Egyptian religion. Her bloodline was absolutely impeccable because she was the daughter, sister, and wife of a king. And she established herself as the god's wife of Amun, was her justification for acceding to the throne of Pharaoh, even though previously it was only men that had been able to occupy that position. But she worked out the theology to the satisfaction of the priests and manipulated the political nature of the situation in incredibly skilled ways. Officially, she ruled jointly with Thutmose III, who had ascended to the throne the previous year as a child of only 2 years old. But given that most 2-year-olds are not capable of running an empire, she was the de facto ruler. She was the wife of his father, even though she wasn't his mother. The interesting thing is that she did such a remarkable job as an administrator. She extended trade and economic development and was more involved in the actual administration of the empire than any previous pharaoh, and probably any pharaoh since then. She was very much a hands-on ruler, in contrast to many others who would delegate the authority of the military to generals and the authority of administering the agricultural harvests and taxes to the priests. And she was so skilled and so smart that her involvement was a great boon to these operations. And she's generally regarded by Egyptologists as one of the most successful pharaohs because she ruled longer than any other woman of an indigenous Egyptian dynasty. According to Egyptologist James Harry Breasted, she's also known as the first great woman of history of whom we are informed, of whom we know their name and their specific accomplishments. Undoubtedly, there have been remarkable women forever, as we've talked about before many times in class. But in terms of knowing someone's name, where they're born, where they're buried, and what they achieved in their lives, she deserves to be recognized. Here's an image of her, obviously a sculptural one rather than a photographic one, but one gets the impression of a great deal of calm confidence and capability. This is the face of a very capable woman. And here's her incredibly beautiful temple at Luxor, one of the true architectural gems of Egypt. It may not be as large as the pyramids at Giza, but it just has such a striking symmetry and beauty to it, and the way it's almost Frank Lloyd Wright style architecture into the landscape sets it apart from a great deal of the other architecture. Following on her footsteps, you have another remarkable Egyptian pharaoh, Akhenaten. And his heresy was proclaiming as pharaoh that there was only one deity, the Aten, the sun disk. This was a challenge to the power of the priesthoods of all of the different gods, since he maintained the divine position of the pharaoh and said that he was the only one who needed to intercede with the divine. It kind of made all of these structure of organized religion and the priesthood irrelevant. As a result, his reign lasted 20 years, which is a fair amount of time, especially in the ancient world. But we have remarkably little left in terms of scripts and images of Akhenaten, because after he was overthrown by a combination of priests and generals from the military, there was an active effort to erase Akhenaten from the pages of Egyptian history by the contemporaries at the time. And they went around and chiseled his name off of just about everything that they could find. Here you can see one of the surviving representations of Akhenaten and his family, with the supreme deity Aten, the sun disk, whom he proclaimed to be the only deity. Here's one of the more naturalistic representations that we have. It's one of the masterpieces of Egyptian sculpture because it really encapsulates a level of realism and naturalism that's uncommon from earlier time periods. You get the impression that this is a very individualized sculpture. Akhenaten, the first proponent of a monotheistic religion in the Near East, and a very interesting figure. And you can see the faces of Egyptians are varied. And this is important, I think, to recall, because throughout time people have tried to represent Egyptians as being of one type of identity or another. The identity of what constitutes Egyptian changes through time. And has never, I think, been an incredibly monolithic thing. We have, the imagery of, Cleopatra, but she was Greek by extraction. Her family were Greeks that came to rule over Egypt. But the Egyptian people themselves, as you recall from the beginning of this lecture, even during that initial formation of the state, when people were fleeing the desertification of the Sahara and coming together in ways that they had not been before, being crammed cheek by jowl together in population densities higher than they had ever been before, undoubtedly that brought lots of people of different tribes and different ways of thinking together. And the geographic areas that Egypt drew upon, all the way down into Nubia and sub-Saharan Africa, and all the way up into the Near East and the Levant. One has to acknowledge that what is an Egyptian, I think that was more a condition of the political and social strictures of the time, rather than being able to say for any one point. It was always diverse, and it's never been an easy question. Egyptians are a people with an incredibly deep history and an incredibly diverse ancestry, and pretty remarkable in that sense. Well, the death of Ramses in 1163 was the beginning of the decline of Egypt. Military setbacks in Nubia and Asia turned the vision inward again, and they ceased to be an expansionist state looking outward, ceased to examine new opportunities for trade and development, and really began to focus on Egypt-centric politics and social concepts. As a result, Egypt fell apart into its constituent states. Military leaders took control of Thebes, and the priesthood of Amun took over other cities, while a dynasty of merchants took over control of the Delta. And Egypt, during the time period of ancient history, was never unified again. And it has only been in the last few hundred years that Egypt has regained a sense of a unified state and a unified society. And so ancient Egypt passed into history, and the Nile region became a part of the wider Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. Thank you, guys. That's the end of our lecture for today. And if you have questions, remember to post them on the discussion board where I will answer them. Have a great rest of your day.